Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Jan Schlechter. I'm a solutions engineer here at CloverDX. Today, I'm going to tell you something about data migration, and I would like to focus especially on some typical mistakes that we see on the projects that we do here at CloverDX. So basically, before we start, we should actually think about what data migration is. And for our purpose, I think we can say that it's a process of making data from original system fit for the purpose in a new system. I would really highlight the purpose here because some of the projects that we can see are sometimes not actually the data migration, or don't necessarily need to be data migrations, because just the original system might be used for can be a little bit extended, or additional tools can be used to basically expose data that the original system already offers. Some characteristics of data migration projects are that they usually take weeks. In most cases, they take months, and sometimes we can see that they even last for years. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And one other thing is that also when we're adopting a new system, the data migration part of it is actually a parallel to the target system implementation. So it's not the same effort as actually implementing the actual new system or acquiring it. The typical components of migration projects are, on one hand, the legacy systems. On the other hand, those are the new systems. Very typical is that we can see, especially in CloverDX, because people usually go to us with very complex problems and very complex data migration projects, is that there are actually multiple of these legacy systems. So one of the reasons for going to the new system might be simply the integration, right? It's difficult to keep multiple existing, say sometimes old technologies, and in-house built customized applications, and things like that. There are many reasons out there that takes us to actually go to the new system. Really, what is important here that we have the two systems, and we need to integrate them somehow. So that's what we have CloverDX here for. It's basically the integration platform that will allow us to migrate the data from the source or source systems into the new systems. In high level, we can see on these projects that they can be split into 4 phases. It's on one hand, the strategy and planning. So defining basically how, or actually what, where we're going to migrate the data. Then in the planning phase, we usually focus on giving more concrete steps to the strategy. So how we will migrate, when we will migrate, we're defining what the problems can arise along the way and things like that. When we have a plan and we want to implement all the pipelines and everything that will help us to migrate the data from the source systems to the new one. And obviously, and when everything is implemented, tested, and pretty much ready to be executed, we proceed to the execution phase. So talking about the strategy is really about articulating and answering the questions that are related to data migration projects. So in a high level, it's talking about data, the environments, applications in general that comes in, excuse me, in play, and all the dependencies that may actually the old system have. So again, from high level, the migration projects, or say the strategy, can be of 2 types. We usually see the big bang and trickle migrations. The big bang migration tend to be used on small projects. So that's typically when the project takes weeks and months. But for the most complicated projects, or the say heavy migration projects with lots of data, lots of modules in the original systems or multiple systems and in general involved, we usually see a trickle migration. A trickle migration is basically different in that the execution phase is basically divided into more steps, and sometimes we can also see that the implementation and testing phase is actually happening while some parts of the original system is being already migrated. Now, we know what is the general strategy, and we need to define the scope, which basically means that we need to define what actually we will be migrating. And you know, this process actually may take quite a long time, and we shouldn't save much on this one. You know, it's really defining about what we will include in the project. So missing some of the components may result in some problems later, because we can really identify along the way that there are some systems that we simply forgot. So working with all the stakeholders and reviewing all the plans and things like that can often prevent many issues that can arise later during the project. And I think from my experience, especially, I think, you know, I've seen many projects that were failing in, say, communication and planning perspective and things like that. And I think really what is key here is to ask yourself a question whether the project is long or short. What actually is long or short project? I would leave that up to you, but because there are many variables that come in play. But you know, giving an example of a long project taking over a year, you know, you will definitely need a decent team or lots of people, and you know, you will need to ensure that all the people communicate well. If they don't, a long project can actually take quite a long time and can be even very long project, right? So I would say for long projects, introducing some appropriate management system, like, you know, all the agile frameworks and DevOps principles and all that stuff should be imposed. Well, for the short project, especially if you think of it like that could be a project for, say, a week or 2 or 3 weeks, it doesn't really worth to spend too much time on training people on some heavy management frameworks. So that's really the message over here. And when we have a general strategy, we want to proceed to giving it more concrete steps. That's what we do in the planning phase. And we should start with defining basically the paths or the plans, right? What I mean by that is that, you know, you should definitely see how you want to proceed. So, you know, what is the ideal path of implementing such project? So this will be the happy path. But often you'll see problems along the way, right? And I would say, especially on the long projects, it's very rare that you wouldn't run into a problem. So defining the unhappy path is critical for making sure that you will deliver the project on time. From our experience, actually, I would say that you know, introducing other plans as well or sub plans may help to manage the potential risks as well. Now, the technical analysis is something that shouldn't be avoided as well. It's especially important because you need to figure out the scope. You know, you will obviously during the strategy you said like how much, you know, what actually are the modules and things like that. But at this time, you will need to give it a more concrete form, right? You need to look closer at the data and see how complex these data are. You know, how what is the sensitivity of data, or what is actually in general the quality. Also, you should think about all the connectivity options that you have to the original system, or to say to the target system, and all that stuff that will actually have impact on other say decision making for say the tech stack that you will use to implement the data migration pipelines. So I would say, thinking about the data in general that you will be migrating, sometimes it's definitely like that you have the data that you have in the source system, but sometimes you also shouldn't forget about dependencies. Dependencies are something that are often forgotten, but are critical as well, because imagine you should ask yourself these two questions at least. Does your legacy system serve as a feed for the other applications? So say, does your old system actually have a REST API that you would like to continue using, or do other applications access the data in the legacy system data storages? Say they connect directly to the database and they somehow work with that. The new system, excuse me, the new system doesn't have to necessarily provide these features, and therefore, again, the integration platform that you will use for the migration can also help you after that migration to expose all these APIs. If you forgot about that, right, you wouldn't probably be ready to get into production when the data is migrated. So dependencies are definitely something that shouldn't be skipped. Now I'm talking about I was talking about the data that we migrate, right? That's definitely something that we shouldn't forget. But the tools that we will use to migrate the data are less important. And I would say probably the most critical decision that you will make is thinking about the tool that you will use to migrate the data. So you have basically two options, right? To use the homegrown data integration scripts. It can be, I don't know, implemented in Python or Scala or Java. There are definitely frameworks that you can leverage and just use, but it tends to be pricey, right? You can imagine that you will need to hire all the experienced developers with the knowledge of all these libraries and everything. That's very few people on the market, and not all of them are actually experienced. On the other hand, you have option to use a major data integration platform, such as CloverDX. It will give you the same flexibility of homegrown data integration scripts, but will allow you to hire people with, say, less experience, and at the same time, but at the same time, it'll allow you to start right away, right? So the learning curve of the technology that you will select is critical as well for the decision making on the platform that you will use. And one thing that should definitely help you as well is understanding the data, right? The data that you will migrate is actually critical, right? That's probably the reason why you're doing that. So the tool that you're using or you will select should be able to connect to all the resources, and should do actually a little bit more. From our experience, it's actually quite often that along the way during the project, you will actually find some other requirements, technical requirement, that some of the tools may be failing. So having flexible tool or tech stack might be critical for success of the project. And obviously the tool, the integration tool, or the integration language, or the library that you will use, not the only technology that you will use. And I definitely would like to highlight a few other things, and that's how you will, basically the tools that will help you to track the work, and the version control systems. Version control systems are not just a product or just a tool, but it should come with a versioning strategy. The versioning strategies is especially critical because this needs to be really followed by everyone on the project. If this is not followed, then you will, again, from long project, you will have very long project, and from short project, you will have a long project. From our experience, and especially from my experience, I can see in many projects, there were people not following the strategies, which were causing a lot of problems. And we sometimes even seen, projects where we spend half of the time just on the overhead that normally shouldn't be even spent on. So that comes with another thing, and that's the team. And I would say, I was talking about the people, the technology, right, and things like that. But having a large project, and that's, in my opinion, a golden rule, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll need a large team. Instead, I would focus on having a small team because it's more manageable, but at the same time, you will need say experienced people that will be able to do the work that normally a horde of people would need to be basically employed for. And obviously there are projects that will require larger teams, but in that case, and this is something, again, I'm probably digging deeper into these management frameworks, but I think it's really important to actually think about that the larger teams should be broken down to smaller teams. So different frameworks will have different recommendations, but from our experience, 8 to 10 people is just probably the maximum size for the ideal team, especially for the experienced people. Now, you have a team, but you also selected a certain stack of technologies that you will work with, and having the team and having the technology doesn't mean that you will actually be successful with the project. So you should make sure that the entire team, and when I'm speaking about the team, I mean the entire team, is fully familiar with the technology. And my experience is that people not following the conventions or the rules that you will introduce to the project will actually cause a lot of mess. That will not only cause the mess and slow down to the people that will create the mess, but it will also create lots of problems to the entire team. So even to people who are highly experienced and basically the people that are the most expensive. This brings me to the basically another topic that is kind of connected to this, and that's conventions and processes. I think, if you're doing projects that will take more than, say, 3-4 months, you'll probably want to introduce some conventions and processes. It's in some areas it's less important, in some areas it's far more important. As an example of a process or of an activity where it's extremely important on data integration projects or data migration projects, I should say, is the data mapping description formalization. This is really crucial because if you don't create certain conventions in the data mapping, you may end up with invalid data in your target environment. And what's even worse is that you will find that out after that data, the final results are already in the production. So that really is what is the last sentence is here. Not having this often leads to the misinterpreted requirements, which means incorrect pipeline implementation, and also invalid tests, because the tester will not understand the mapping, right? So they will create invalid tests. And as a result, you will see invalid resulting data. And only the business users will afterwards uncover this, because this will come back to them. So talking about the data mapping, I think what really is important is to use a language that everyone understands and doesn't allow alternative explanation. And I know that this is extremely difficult, especially thinking about, you know, how broad the team is, you know, and what are all the stakeholders that will work with these plans. But it is really important, and it doesn't necessarily have to be some programming language or something like that. It can be actually, you know, the visual diagrams or some formalized pseudocode or things like that. Really, it's up to you as a team to decide what the language will be. Just make sure that everyone understands, and it's as formal as possible for everyone to capture the idea of what the mapping should look like. That's definitely very important, but what's also important is versioning the data mapping. It's often forgotten, and I can tell you that, you know, I've seen way too many projects where people were working with different versions of the documents that they are sharing across the organization. That's a nightmare, right? You know, if the business user will provide you with something that, you know, the other people don't understand or have old version, then it's a big problem. They will implement completely different thing. And, you know, if development, tests, and QA team and say even the say some support or you know, these people will have the wrong data mapping version, they will say everything is fine. But it's not going to be fine, obviously, because they would be working with a different version. So make sure that you use the same language, everyone understands that, and you use a version control system to version the data mapping, and make sure that everyone who will version this will understand how to version these documents. Now, this is all nice, but as we all know, especially on the long projects, you know, nothing's going to stay the same for the entire time of the project. So make sure that you factor known unknowns into your estimates. It will definitely change. You will get new requirements along the way, and you should make sure that you're flexible enough, and that again, when it comes to the agile methodologies and things like that will help you to somehow adapt to the changes and the additional requirements along the way. Now we have everything planned and everything is nice. We are ready to implement. So we should now follow the plan that we prepared, and we should develop the migration pipelines. Definitely, what we should start with is basically the data itself. You know, here you can see a Gaussian distribution where you can see that probably the most data will be somewhere over here. You know, they will be of say medium complexity, right? But it's not all the data. And often I can see that this is actually the area that most of say people who are not experienced with data integration will focus on. You know, but where the problems are actually, and where you spend the most time, is actually this part. So from our experience, we can definitely say that you should start with the most complex data and the most complex problems in general at first, because this will help you to make sure that you can track that you're still on track. You know, you're still following the happy path. If you started over here, you would probably update your management with false information about whether you were able to make the deadline or not. So another advantage of focusing on this area is that, you know, this is usually the same or very similar data to the rest of it. So solving problems over here in this section will actually, in many cases, will help you to solve the problems of the remaining distribution. Now, we know what are our data, we started implementing and things like that, but often what we can see is that people tend to say underestimate the testing, but the testing is actually something that shouldn't be not only omitted, but it should not be underestimated. So what we can often see is that the developers or the test team will fabricate 5 records, say for functionality, and they will test it. Now you may ask yourself, is that enough? Well, they can say, yeah, definitely. Will we capture all the use cases and all the scenarios that can potentially happen? But in a real world, that's not what happens. The data is usually very diverse, and they contain a lot of mass and problems and things like that. So our recommendation here, and this is definitely from experience, a thing that should be followed, is to use anonymization of your production data. As long as it's possible, you should stay as close to your production data as possible already during development and testing, because this will allow you to actually make and develop the pipelines the way that they will be, say, without problems delivered to the production environment afterwards. In CloverDX, again, we have a lot of frameworks and other approaches and technologies to anonymize the data. We've done that for in different industries, so definitely we'll be happy to help as well. Now, we implemented, we tested everything and things like that. Imagine a trickle migration, right? And everything goes perfectly fine, and you're saying yourself, maybe, well, I should tell someone, well, we're doing really great, and we're going to be much faster delivering the outcome. But that's not, from our experience, what you should do, right? Instead, you should keep doing what you're doing right now, instead of overpromising and reducing the timelines, which is already allocated to the project, right? So, and again, like, the longer the project is, you will most likely run again into issues that will cost you additional time. So even if you're doing right now perfectly fine, and you're even faster, much faster than you were supposed to be, I'm pretty sure you will run into some issue sooner or later, and this will cost you some time. So definitely don't overpromise. But in the other case, if you're late already, and that you're late, you shouldn't keep silent. Instead, you should communicate the problems and the delay and all that stuff to all the stakeholders, because this can be really important for everyone. Nothing is worse than staying silent and not doing anything and waiting for the problem to arise at the end of the project, or when everyone expects the data to be delivered. So we developed everything, we tested everything, it's perfectly fine. We're happy with what we're getting in our pre-production environments, and now we're ready to execute the pipelines that we developed, right? So in this case, I would like to mention a few things that are also kind of important points here, and that's communication. Communication is definitely important, because I've seen many times that people, it was on the plan to execute it today, but no one was informed. So you should make sure that actually, when you proceed to the execution, you should communicate that you're going to do that, and what are the expected outcomes, and how it should be tested and all that stuff. So that's another part of it. You should prepare detailed reports to to actually inform everyone that, you know, what is the quality of the data, how we were doing with the migration and all that stuff. So make sure that the communication is well established in the organization for this project, especially for especially the business user should be informed about all the potential risks and what will happen to the data, because that can definitely be critical for the business. And one thing that we also deliver with the projects often is something that we call hypercare. And hypercare really is that we will dedicate developers to the production environment, or to monitor and help and support the solution during and a little bit after the execution, so that if anything goes wrong, or if any problem has appeared, you know, we're here to help. So hypercare is definitely a good idea. Before execution, you know, everyone usually do backups, but what is sometimes forgotten is to test your backups. So you should actually test your backups. You should make sure that, you know, the backups that you have will get you to the state where you at least was before. If you didn't test your backup, and I've actually seen that you know, the IT operations was just partially part of the migration project, and then, you know, we ended up in a situation, or the client actually executed their pipeline, and they found out that, you know, things went wrong. So they reached out to the IT operations, and it turned out that the backups were not completely what it was supposed to be. So test your backups up front, because it can be critical, and you can save your project. And one more thing that I'd like to specify, especially for the trickle migration, is automation. You know, for the big bank, it's not a big deal. It's probably you will have the migration pipelines being triggered once, but even for that, you know, and especially for the trickle migration, you want to automate this process of deploying and execution. The reason is not only that you will save a lot of money, that it's preventing potential errors that can arise during the manual processing. If you have people, you know, doing the, you know, clicking in somewhere in the environments and doing the stuff, that's not very safe. It's not testable. You cannot test it up front. You cannot test people up front, right? So instead, if you will have the pipelines that set up and say, you know, the process in general, that will be completely automated, you can test it up front. You can be sure that what you will deliver to the production will be of certain quality. That's very, very good. That's a huge benefit over the manual processing. And like I said, the cost-effective solution this would be for the trickle migration. Now, probably the last thing that I would like to mention is the audit, or testing the data. From our experience, again, I would say that the best tests and the best way to ensure that the data that you migrated into target environment is to compare it to the old data, right? To the new or the data in the new environment with the data in the old environment. Obviously, this is not possible every time, because the structures of the old system, well, systems sometimes, right, is different to the structure of data in the newer systems. Sometimes it's, I don't know, relational database on size. Sometimes it's NoSQL database. It's completely different, and you know, you need to somehow work with that. So if you're not able, and if you don't have the test pipelines to compare these data against each other, or to these two systems against each other, then you should probably set up some KPIs that will help you to ensure that the migration is of certain quality. So in other words, you should, for example, make sure that all of your clients will have the same number of invoices if you're migrating these kind of data, right? And that the total amount is the same, and things like that. Basically, it's up to you to set up the KPIs, but you should measure the quality of the data that will land in the production in the new environment before you decommission the old system. And you shouldn't actually decommission the old system because unless you are actually 100% sure that the migration that you did was 100% fine. That's pretty much about the data migration. I would like to tell you a little bit more about CloverDX also. That is the data integration and management platform that we use for data migration projects. And there are some reasons why I actually use CloverDX for data migration projects. First of all, I would say that, you're not gonna, with CloverDX, you're not gonna end up in a situation that, your vendor that delivered that migration or even the integration platform will not gonna respond, right? We're always here. We're delivering both, right? We're delivering both the integration platform as well as the solution. And our team that we have, the enablement team and the solutions team that we have here at CloverDX, is not only focused at the product itself, but we usually focus and we help usually our customers with the most complex scenarios. So we understand, and we're actually happy that our customers are able to say, develop their frameworks and everything in CloverDX, because the learning curve of CloverDX is actually very, very steep. So they can adapt the technology very quickly. But if you're running into some issues, or if you're having a really complex problem, then we're here to help. And that's what we do as a team. And also the messy data. Messy data is something that you will definitely see in most of the complex problems or complex integration data migration projects. CloverDX has many tools out of the box that will help you to treat the data. We have definitely lots of say approaches how to treat it, and we have lots of experience with that. And one more thing, what will definitely matter is when you need to do, or how much time you have to deliver the product. And with CloverDX, there are many features, but one of them is really important and can save a lot of time, and that's reusability. So think of it that you will design pipelines, or one pipeline that that part of it you will reuse in, I don't know, 50 other jobs. So if that's the case in CloverDX, you can reuse simply the part. You can wrap it into a piece of code and basically just use it as one component in another pipeline. So reusability allows you to build large frameworks and very robust and very, say, even not only developer, but also user-friendly framework and data environment, I would say. If we take a look a little bit at the CloverDX architecture, it really is split to two products. On one hand, or on one side, most of your developers will work with the designer. Designer is basically an IDE where you will prototype, build, where you will test, and you will also version your code and all that stuff. And then you will deploy into the server. Server, on the other hand, will allow you to automate and orchestrate and pretty much, like publish your custom REST APIs that you can visually actually do with CloverDX as well. And sometimes, when you will end up in a situation, you start with a small thing, and then you will end up with situation that you need to, scale it out. So with CloverDX, you can actually employ additional server nodes without changing pretty much the solution that you already have. And you can scale both horizontally, like I said, adding additional nodes, CloverDX server nodes, or you can just scale vertically to adding additional server cores, or say the CPUs or the cores to the existing server. Before we wrap it up, I would just say one more thing about these case studies. We have in the presentation the links to these 3 case studies that might be interesting for you. So definitely go through these. If you had any questions, we'll be happy to assist and provide any help. And that's pretty much it from my side. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Jan. It's a great presentation. I hope everybody found some interesting stuff in there to help you in your planning your migrations. The case studies that Jan just mentioned, I just popped the links in the chat there in case you'd like to go and have a look at those now. I'll include those in the email that we send out after this as well, so you'll have those along with the recording. Just one quick call for if anybody has any more questions, just to pop them in the Q&A box, and I'll throw those over to Jan to answer those. But while you're doing that, I just want to mention a couple of other upcoming webinars. We generally hold webinars in this session, in this slot every week. So next Tuesday, we are looking at how to bring legacy systems into your modern tech stack. And the following Tuesday, we're actually off for the holiday break, but we are actually doing another session on December the 16th that is looking at our new release of CloverDX. So the version 5.13 is coming out in December. So we are looking at all the new features and improvements in that. So if you want to see a little bit more about the latest in CloverDX, then come along to that one too. I've just put the links in the chat as well. And again, we'll send those out over email as well. So hopefully you'll find something to come along to. So let me just pop back to the questions. So yeah, we've had a few come in on the chat. First one is, when you say big bang migrations, do you mean online migrations and trickle as offline migrations, or is it something else?
I think the question is really good. I would say big bang migrations is really, or the difference is really between the how you decide to deploy into production. So the big bang is meant to be really migrated all your data at once, but the trickle migration instead is something that you deploy along the way, right? So you have a lot of data. Sometimes, I've seen multiple of these examples. So say you have multi-tenant application where you have lots of your clients shared in the same database, but you want to migrate the data tenant by tenant, right? So that could be one example. Sometimes it might be that you need to migrate just per modules, right? So you want to say migrate at first the life insurance. Sometimes afterwards you need to migrate to another type of insurance, or I don't know, these kind of things. So these are pretty much the difference between big bang and trickle. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Do you have any recommendations for reconciliation tools post database migration?
Well, that's also another great question. What we do in CloverDX is that we also define our say reconciliation tools or reconciliation pipelines and CloverDX. So I would say, with CloverDX, you really only need one tool. You don't need to use anything else. It's up to you how you design these pipelines, which basically gives you the additional flexibility to not to rely only on some additional software that not only you would have to pay for, because that's another tool, but also that basically allows you to develop it to your needs.
Okay, next up, what kind of information do we have? sorry, I'll start again. What kind of information do we have to understand or consider for the data understanding part?
I think really, you know, it really depends on what kind of you're working with, but the complexity that I said before is something that really is the key probably in all the projects. So if you're say if you know that you're going to work with XML files or JSON files or, you know, these kind of things, structured or EDI files where you have you know, some of the documents with just, I don't know, 20 elements, and other files will have hundreds or thousands of these elements and very dynamic structures. Then I would definitely focus on the most complex ones at first, because sometimes, and usually these two also share, sometimes they share actually the same schema. So the simple documents doesn't necessarily mean that they're or sorry, the most complex documents doesn't necessarily mean that all the other will share the same problems. But at the same time, if you focus only on the simple ones, probably you would have problem with the bigger ones, and that would be quite too late for that.
Okay, next we have a question about selecting tools. So someone says tool selection is a challenge, third party or in-house, like for on-prem to cloud. Microsoft has tool sets like DMS, DMA, etc. Third party, we have Click, etc. Do you have any insights which help in that tool selection process?
You know, from our perspective, we tend to be competing with additional tools as well. But in general, I think there are really like two, and for data migration, I think I would go with the tool that gives you probably the most flexibility. So you know, there are definitely all the tools will do 90% of the work that, you know, you could do with pretty much anything. You know, that even sometimes you can do it even with Excel, right? But that's probably not what you want to do, especially on larger projects. So focusing, and I don't have any recommendation on a tool to help you with the selection process, but you should really think about what is your data, what is your what is the, say, stack of technologies that you will work with, right? So if you're going to work with relational databases, if you're going to work with NoSQL databases, if you will work with HTTP APIs or message queues and these kind of things, you know, I would build a list of all these resources, and based on that, I would decide. And that obviously that's not the end, because you should also keep in mind that what you came from, or what you has analyzed and identified during the strategy planning and the planning itself may not be all of that. That's what I wanted to mention before, because probably during the project you will also find or, you know, jump into a situation where there will be additional requirement, and having a tool that is just, you know, matching your requirements and nothing else might be a problem, because that might be a risk for you. So having very flexible and adjustable and expandable solution and tool might be really a good fit. From our experience, you know, people go to us because they are, especially like working with a cloud based data integration tools, which have certain limits, and in the case they tend to you know, migrate to tools that offers basically both like on-prem and cloud, basically even the hybrid integration options and deployment and things like that. So that's pretty much it.
And actually, we have some sort of nice follow-up questions to that, asking about CloverDX specifically. So how would CloverDX fit in where we already have native tools? What extra edge would it give? Performance capability, performance compatibility, etc. And maybe I'll just combine another question along with that. Question about CloverDX supports which database types, sources and targets. And also a question about whether CloverDX supports online migrations for heterogeneous migration types like Oracle on-prem to Azure SQL.
You know, if you're about to extend your existing, say, solution, or you know, anything like that, CloverDX is just perfect. Especially, you know, we have many of our clients actually leverage what they have already custom developed, right? So they have their Python scripts or Java libraries and things like that. So if there is a need for that, Clover definitely have components and tools for leveraging these, you know, what is already developed in house. Obviously, and then basically that's to answer the other question, or the other part of the question is the list of the resources CloverDX can work with is virtually unlimited. I've been working with CloverDX for, I don't know, 9 or 10 years, and I haven't been in a situation that we wouldn't be able to connect to. So it's literally like everything that you can think of, there is a connector for, or there is a solution to connect to, right? So I would say CloverDX is the tool that will give you the flexibility along the project, along the way, to adapt to even the additional requirements.
Oh, thank you. And I think that's everything we have for questions right now. So just give everybody a couple of seconds in case there's any last minute questions. But it doesn't look like it. So I think, yeah, we'll wrap up today. So thank you very much, Jan, for a great presentation. And thank you to everybody for attending. And thank you for some great questions, everyone. And we hope to see you on another one of our webinars soon.
All right, thank you.
Bye.